Hello and welcome back to this Down for the Idealistic Crusade. This will be a short video going over the recent book finds I made at some of our local bookshops. And as usual, if you've seen any of my other videos, my tastes are generally old movie tie-ins, paperbacks, classic adventure fiction, spy fiction, various series, and of course hard-boiled detective fiction and a lot of other things, but also a great deal of focus on various film books, movie star biographies, if you will, or any sort of biography or autobiography of film-related personnel. So I found an interesting stack of books I wanted to go over. First is a really cool artifact of its time, I guess. I've found one of these before, and this is the only other one I've ever stumbled across. This one's in a little bit better shape, but it's definitely got some browning with age. But it's one of the really cool tie-ins for the classic Avengers series. So this is actually the first volume in this run, and I believe the printings were a little bit different here in the US compared to the UK counterparts. But again, it's such a cool piece, I couldn't just leave it sitting there. And even though it's got a little bit of browning, it's, again, a lot better than the other edition I have. These are apparently a mixture of both novelizations of the actual episodes and then also some original stories as well. But it's such a iconic show for me, and something I grew up with, that I couldn't resist digging into the spin-off novels. I'm also trying to read all of Alistair MacLean's fiction, and this is actually one I hadn't gotten in paperback. This is a collection of short stories entitled The Lonely Sea, so it's primarily seafaring tales. This is in the Fawcett paperback design that matches with the other stories from this time period and in the various reprints. So if you're collecting MacLean's novels and fiction work, you can find most of them in this rather nice series, and his novels are very inexpensive. Of course, they sold tons of them back in the day, so most bookshops usually have a bunch or a MacLean shelf, if you will, but it's harder to find other volumes, and again, I've just been meaning to read more of his fiction, so anytime I can chip one off, then I'll go for it if it's a nice paperback like this. It's got a little bit of wear, but for the dirt cheap price I paid, actually just a quarter really, I couldn't say no. This is something I've wanted to check out for far too long, and they are quite uncommon and very collectible. But this is from Avon's legendary paperback series of The Ghost Who Walks. So this is from their Phantom book series, and these were published in the 70s. They are largely based around the original comic strip stories, or newspaper strip stories, I should say. They are just, turned into novel form, but there's a lot more material added from my understanding, so they are expanded and built upon the original strip stories. They're in these wonderful matching designs, beautiful artwork on these, and red-edged pages, so they have a very signet 60s paperback feel that I really enjoy. This isn't in perfect shape, and it does have some browning, but again, I have never been able to stumble across one of these in the wild, and this was super cheap, so I've been wanting to read these for ages. Hermes Press, who's done a lot of Phantom reprints and other classic characters, they have reprinted the series in its entirety, and I have wanted to check those out, but saying I've never read one of the Avon books. I wanted to at least read one first before buying the whole reprint series, because even these can go for quite a bit. Like if you're going on eBay and you look for some of these Avon novels, and when they're in better shape, they can go for quite a bit, and even in shape like this, they can go for, anywhere between $5 and $20 each, depending on the book and condition. So it was a real surprise to find one of these in the wild, just sitting on the shelf and not having to pay a rare book price for it. So I can't wait to read this. Next is a really cool trade paperback anniversary edition of George Higgins's The Friends of Eddie Coyle. I, of course, love the film starring Robert Mitchum, directed by Peter Yates, but I've never read the novel. So this really cool edition that's very much in what you see a lot of the modern Black Lizard paperbacks looking like. It just drew me right to it. It's got a little bit of wear, but of course, you come to expect that digging around in used bookshops, but it's uncommon to find classic crime novels like this in the fancy reprints, also on the used shelf at used prices. So it does have a new introduction, but otherwise there's no extras for it being an anniversary edition, but it just looks really nice, and I especially love the orange in paper. Next, as I'm also trying to read every Patricia Highsmith novel, I picked up a copy of The Trimmer of Forgery. This is her 1969 novel. This is a later printing in the same series that I've gotten another of her books in, and it's a really nice trade paperback. I've read a lot of good stuff about this, and it's always been on my to-read list, simply for the fact that the whole plot setup is a would-be movie writer on location trying to write a script, gets drawn into a whole nefarious scheme. And so just that as a backdrop really drew my attention. And of course, the fact that the blurb on here is Graham Greene saying that this is her finest novel, well, just hold me back. So I can't wait to check this out. And again, it's a really nice release from Atlantic Monthly Press. So I don't know if they did all her novels like this, but I now have 2 of this particular series. And it's a really nice, sturdy, and thick trade paperback. Next is a book that everybody should read at least once. It's one of the greatest memoirs of all time, and I've always wanted to get one of the nicer, more modern editions. This was actually the edition I read when I read it in the library years ago, and I always wanted to get this particular copy. So I was really happy when I found the 2003 reprinting of Errol Flynn's memoirs, My Wicked, Wicked Ways. Again, this is one of the greatest memoirs you will ever read. It is sprawling and unflinching in its detail. This printing is rather nicely done and has a photo section, and the cover has a slight laminate gloss on it too. So again, if you want to read this, I do recommend getting one of the nicer editions like this, and this will be a book that you'll go back to a number of times. Flynn himself was an aspiring author, and this is one of those great memoirs where there are factual things, but then there are some more of the tall tales type stories. So I think this was a definite influence on what would come later, particularly when David Niven would write his iconic memoirs, which had a similar sort of feel. And of course, Niven and Flynn were lifelong friends, so it makes sense that their memoirs would have a certain similar twinkle in the eye quality to them. So if you're a Flynn fan and you've never read this, I don't know what you're doing with your life. And if you love memoirs and biographies and autobiographies, this is an absolute must. Again, it's one of those you can't really put down because you get sucked into it from the very first page. Next is, I couldn't believe was in the bookstore, but I've always wanted to read a really good Glen Ford biography. And I actually wasn't aware that his son had written this book entitled Glen Ford, A Life, and it's got some really great blurbs. Scott Eyman, the great biographer, has a blurb on the back, and the foreword is by one of my other favorite biographers, Patrick McGilligan. So that, plus the fact that it was written by Ford's son, that just all of those tick the right boxes. So I can't wait to dig into this. There is a photo section. It is printed in black and white as well, and it's a pretty lengthy book. It clocks in at about a little over 300 pages or so. So it gets should get into a good amount of detail. I do hate it when good or bad biographies are too short. I think a biography should at least be 250, 300 pages, because anything less, you start to feel shortchanged because you get into it and then you feel like you're just not getting all the detail because suddenly the book has to hurry up and end and it's over. So I've always wanted to read a book on Ford, as I said, so this just seemed perfect. So I can't wait to dig into this. Then, because I'm a sucker for these kinds of books, this is, again, one of those film-related books that is very much pre-internet and is loaded with beautiful stills. So it's a type of book that isn't written much anymore, but being a lifelong, forever Raymond Chandler geek, I couldn't resist this beautiful-looking book entitled Raymond Chandler in Hollywood. And this is, again, one of those old affairs loaded with stills and nice text. This gives you a cultural background about what is now termed as Raymond Chandler's Los Angeles, the the LA that's envisioned in his masterpiece novels, and then goes into his Hollywood days as a screenwriter, and then gets into the various adaptations of his work, particularly in the adaptations of the Marlowe novels. And it goes up through when this book was written in 1982. So here's stills from the film Marlowe with James Garner, and of course there's Bruce Lee there in his little cameo, which should have been a bigger part of the film. Unfortunately, it wasn't. But it basically goes up through the Robert Altman Long Goodbye, and then the first of the Mitchum films, the 1975 Farewell My Lovely, and then the second, the British set, The Big Sleep. So again, it's just one of those things where I couldn't pass it up. You've got, of course, a section on double indemnity, and then here's a really nicely printed still from the deleted ending of The Gas Chamber. So I love getting books like this because the way the stills are printed, it has really held up well. And there's Alan Ladd there. So I just couldn't resist, and I'm really interested to read the text because I love reading what anybody has to say about Chandler. And this just seemed like a much more intensive study of not just Chandler's outlook and his literary work, but then how he approached his screenwriting career. And I'm very curious to see the author's interpretations or takeaways from the various cinematic offerings they have made out of the Marlowe novels. Personally, I don't think anyone has ever done them justice. The only truly great Chandler-based film is the Howard Hawks' Big Sleep, which found a way to get the innocuence, that sort of inherent cynicism and charm of, more particularly the earlier Marlowe novels. You pretty much have that film, which is an iconic masterpiece. Murder My Sweet, made out of Farewell My Lovely, is an iconic noir, which does get across most of what Chandler had in the novel. You couldn't do Chandler novel straight adaptation during the production code, of course, but those two are the closest and the best, I think. And then your results are going to vary after that point. There is good stuff in the Altman Long Goodbye. Mitchum is amazing as Marlowe. He should have been playing it in the golden age of Hollywood. But at least he did get to play it, even though the films are of varying quality. So this just seems too good to pass up, and I can't wait to read through this. Just again, as a Chandler geek, you can't help but want to read everything there is. There's even, of course, a section about Strangers on a Train, which Chandler started writing, but of course he and Hitchcock did not get along at all, so he was eventually replaced. And again, this is going through his entire Hollywood career, which not every book does. So that's why I can't wait to dig through this. So that's it for this edition of Book Finds. Again, you never know what's going to pop up in your local bookstore, so you should always keep supporting your local independent bookstores. That way we can keep them in business and keep finding great new things to read. So as always, keep reading print books, keep reading ebooks, just keep reading. And thanks ever so much for watching.